Stay classy, Golden Eagles. I hope all of you are doing well. Just want to give you another video and talk to you guys a little bit about how Google Classroom is going to be used, our read alouds, and some of the other things that we're going to be doing all through Google Classroom. First of all, I want to say I hope everything's going well with you and your family and you guys are staying safe. A couple things you guys probably already saw. All of our learning for the future is going to be done on Google Classroom. Until we get back into our physical classroom, room 203, expect everything to be showing up on Google Classroom. There's going to be about between 2 to 4 activities per day. Some days it'll just be, hey, continue on this, or other days it'll be something entirely new. So keep an eye out for that. Make sure that you guys are showing grit, trying your best, and working hard to get everything done that you can, okay? A couple things really quick that I wanted to talk about is the comment section on Google Classroom is open. Please use that for learning purposes. Now, guys, I know that you guys are out. You haven't seen each other, and you probably won't see each other for a little bit. I think it's okay to be like, hey, how are you? I hope everyone's doing well. But let's not start a personal chat that everyone can see or that makes other people feel not a part of it. Does that make sense? I hope it does. Another thing, if you guys have questions on those comments, it's a great place to ask questions. Okay, that's a great place for me to ask, or for you to ask questions and me to answer, or maybe some of your other classmates can answer. So guys, help each other out. I can only be on there a certain amount of times a day because I have other things that I have to do to prep for the next day's activities and lessons. Does that make sense? So ask questions and either I'll respond or answer, or if you have that answer and you're a student and you can help out a friend, please do. Okay, make sense? Another thing, keep up on your Outread Mr. Ferguson challenge. I am reading at home. I'm actually reading more and more than ever, so I'm expecting you guys to read more and more. Pretty much you can assume every day with one of our activities that I'm going to ask you to read 30 minutes a day. Now, some days you're going to be asked to read maybe fiction stories, maybe you're going to ask to read nonfiction, maybe you're going to be asked to read a graphic novel, or maybe read with your brother or sister if you happen to be home with your brother or sister, or have a brother and sister. So just kind of keep an eye out for that. Now, I know a lot of you guys maybe have a limited amount of books at home, or books that you've already read. Now, do remember you're using a Chromebook. You can search online and have your parents help you, but you can search online for articles that interest you. I could start posting some of those things like that, just some things you might be interested in reading. Does that make sense? Okay. Another thing, guys, if you happen to have your book trailer book at home and you have finished reading it, you are welcome to go ahead and start creating a book trailer. Okay, just make sure that when you're creating a book trailer, you're doing it under the account that fits for you. Remember, we split it up between A through H, I want to say, and then I through Z. So just be picking there, and then maybe remember, change the title to be your last name, and this time it's going to be the number 2. Okay, last time we did it with the number 1. Your last name and the number 1. And remember to be saving frequently, okay, ladies and gentlemen? Now, if you left your book trailer book at school and you obviously can't go to get it, start reading another book. Or if you've been reading a book, you're welcome to do it. The only thing that I ask is it's a book you've never read before. 2, it's not a graphic novel. And 3, it's over 125 pages, okay? There's no due date on that or anything. I just think it would be really nice if you guys were able to do that, to be reading, to have some fun activities, to create those book trailers. Remember, and the rubrics are kind of posted or what's supposed to be in there, to include those things, okay? It's not just the cool pictures, right? We want to know what your story is about. Don't tell us at all. Don't give us away the end plot. Don't give us away the Thanos secret, right? We talked about that, okay? But make us interested. Your goal and the whole learning target behind that is to get your peers interested in reading that book, okay? Lastly, sometimes, guys, I'm going to ask you before an activity, it'll have a materials list. You need a piece of paper, pencil, or whatever you may need, okay? Ask your mom and dad to help you guys find some of that at home if you don't know where that is. And other times I may even ask you to get, like, there was a science activity today, to get a glass of water and a pencil. Make sure that you're asking mom and dad if that's okay. And if it's not, you can still do most all the activities without the materials that I'm asking. Do your best, show grit. I know it's not ideal for anyone's situation right now. We'd much rather be in the classroom. I miss you guys. I wish we were all there together, but that's just not the reality right now, okay? So I'm going to read The Stout Hearted Seven, Orphaned on the Oregon Trail. And then after this book is over, I want to tell you about the next read aloud book. And again, I don't know if I said this earlier, but I'll say it again. These read alouds I want to try to do pretty frequently, but I'm not going to do them daily like we normally do. It's just a lot of work for me. I'm going to try to do like 2 a week, maybe more. But just know that it's probably not going to be something that is done daily. But sit back and relax. Enjoy the book. Chapter 18. Kathleen and her sisters climbed stiffly out of the wagon and looked around. They could not yet believe they were safe. Mrs. Saunders, who had ridden with them, led them across an open courtyard to a candlelit room where several men were sitting. Matilda, eyes wide, walked straight into a white-haired stranger. "Are you Uncle Pete?" He bent over towards her. "What did you say, little girl? Are you Uncle Pete, the man who bought us from the Indians? If you are, I want to thank you." "That pays me well." Peter Shea Ogden laughed and set her on his knee. From that moment, she became his special pet. The 4 girls were most tenderly cared for. Everyone seemed to realize that all of the captives they had suffered the most. Many of the women had lost their husbands, but still had their children. The children had lost their fathers, but their mothers were still with them. The Sager girls had lost their second set of parents, both brothers and 1 sister. What was to become of them, no one yet could tell, for they had no known relatives. On the following day, when the chiefs came to collect the ransom, the captives learned that the price for their freedom had been 62 3-point Hudson's Bay blankets, 63 cotton shirts, 12 guns, 600 loads of ammunition, 12 flints, 37 pounds of tobacco, worth altogether about $500. The Sager girls were delighted to find that Mr. Stanley, the artist, was there. He told them he had been on his way to Wapata the day of the massacre when the Spokane Indian guide had learned the terrible news from a passing acquaintance. Stanley had stopped at the fort while the guide hurried back to tell the Ells and the Walkers. Mr. Ogden sent word to the Spaulding family to come, and anxious days followed while those in the fort waited for them to arrive. Some of the young Cayuse had bragged that Mr. Spaulding would never get there alive. They had not counted on the devotion of the Nez Perce, who had formed a bodyguard to surround Mr. and Mrs. Spaulding and their 3 young children, Mary Johnson. The day they reached the fort, a shout of relief went up from those inside, especially Eliza. It had been decided that from Fort Walla Walla, the survivors would travel down to the Columbia River to Fort Vancouver, and while waiting for the Spauldings, the women had made good use of their time to bake quantities of bread and cook pots of meat for the trip. At dawn on Monday, January 3rd, 1849, the Hudson's Bay men lined up their 3 large boats at the edge of the river. Each boat could carry 15 to 20 passengers and 8 paddlers. The former captives hurried down from the fort and took their place while armed men stood on guard. The Manson boys were going to their father in Vancouver, but David Milan would have to stay behind. Mr. McBean, the new Hudson's Bay factor, said because the boy was an Indian, not a member of Dr. Whitman's family, there would be no one in the valley to take charge of him. As the boats shot out into the current of the mighty Columbia River, Catherine and her sisters looked back to see him standing alone on the shore, crying as if his heart would break. The girls felt that they had lost another brother. Uncle Pete had assigned the Sager girls and Mr. Stanley to his own boat. Together, the 2 men struggled to keep the children as comfortable as possible. Mr. Ogden, big, jolly fellow, told stories of his adventures to take their minds off the dangers that still haunted them, both of the Indians and from the river itself. The higher the waves and wind, the louder the laughter and the faster he talked. Mr. Stanley kept Matilda and Elizabeth on the thwart beside him, and his own blanket wrapped around them on top of theirs. Even so, they ached with cold long before Mr. Ogden ordered the boats ashore for the night. As soon as they set foot on land, the men hurried up the bank to set the tents and start the fires. Though Henrietta was only 3.5 years old and thin from her illness, she was a heavy load for Catherine as she struggled out of the boat. Suddenly, she felt the child lifted from her arms. Uncle Pete handed her his gun holster. "You be my armor bearer, and I'll carry the baby." Catherine laughed for the first time that day. From then on, this was the procedure every time they went ashore. After a quick supper, everyone crawled into their tents for shelter from the bitter wind and bedded down as best they could. Again, Mr. Stanley came to the aid of the Sager girls, giving them his blanket. "How will you keep warm?" Catherine asked him. "Oh, I'll bunk with Uncle Pete. He is fat enough to keep us both at a boiling point." His jolly laugh reassured the shivering girls. On the afternoon of the 6th day, the boatmen suddenly began to sing and paddle with great speed. The refugees, who had been huddling silently together, sat up as if new life had been poured into them. Along the shore, they saw a great court of men, waving their hats and yelling as the boat swung into the beach, Fort Vancouver. The great fort of which father and mother had spoken so often of. The girls marveled at the high walls, the corners, and the British Union Jack flag flying above the main building. 2 days later, the drab little party again took to the boats to cross the Columbia and paddle a short distance up the Willamette River to the new city of Portland, Oregon. There, about 50 Oregon volunteers were camped across the river, and as the canoes appeared, the soldiers fired a salute. At the first shot, the Sager girls dropped to the bottom of the boat, sure that they were going to be killed. But Mr. Stanley bent over. "It's all right, little ones. They're just welcoming you." The children could now see some of the soldiers getting into boats to cross over to them. Catherine recognized General Cornelius Gilman, who had been with their wagon train and now was the leader of the volunteers. He leapt to the dock and hurried to the girls, standing beside Mr. Ogden. "Mr. Ogden, I want to shake hands with my young friends, the Sager girls. I remember your parents well," he said, to the comfort of Catherine in particular. To think that someone here knew them. To their surprise, Captain Shaw, their old friend, was there also with his 3 sons, all members of the volunteers. Everywhere were smiling faces, making the girls feel less alone. They met Governor Abernathy, who had once been a missionary and knew the Whitmans, and he invited the Spaldings and the Sagers to stay at his home in Oregon City a few miles upstream for a day or two. Mr. Stanley hurried away without saying goodbye. Catherine felt a little hurt about it, but soon saw him coming back along the rough street carrying several packages. "Now then, my little friends, I want you to have something to remember me by." He gave one package to each girl. "Don't open them now, but when you get to your new home, wherever it may be, you will find enough cloth in each package for a new dress." "Oh, thank you, Mr. Stanley," they shouted. "New dresses. Did anyone ever need them more?" "Come, children," Mr. Spalding called. "The governor's boat is waiting." The girls clambered over the side of the canoe with the Spaldings and the governor. 2 men paddled it upriver until they came in sight of a magnificent waterfall where the Willamette River poured over great rock ledges. At one side, a small town had grown up with houses both above and below the falls. Oregon City, capital of the Provincial Territory. They walked up the rough street, Eliza Spalding with her family and the Sager girls lagging behind, so tired they could hardly walk. The others reached the governor's house and climbed a short flight of steps to the open door where his wife waited to greet them. Catherine heard the voices, then the door closed. She and her sister seemed to have been forgotten. At the foot of the steps they stood in a forlorn little group, Henrietta leaning against Catherine, Matilda and Elizabeth beside her. From the river below them rose a thick, cold fog. The roar of the falls sounded like thunder. All around stood a forest of fir trees so tall they seemed to pierce the sky. A damp, pungent odor assaulted the girls' nostrils. As the short January day waned on, darkness came down upon them, broken only here and there by the feeble light of a candle in the houses they could not see. Matilda and Elizabeth began to cry softly, their tears making cold, wet spots in Catherine's ragged dress. An awful feeling of desolation swept over them. Never, in all the terrible weeks behind them, had they felt so utterly alone. Mental pictures flashed across her mind. Papa's burial place beside the Green River, Mama's at Pilgrim Springs, that dreadful long grave at Wapata where John and Frank lay, Louise all by herself. Oh, why had they ever left Missouri? Oh, why had they not all died at Wapata? At least they would have been together, she thought, and wished she could lie down here and never get up again. Then somehow, like a flower pushing its way up through the frozen earth, a memory grew and blossomed in her mind. As clearly as it were happening right now, she heard voices. Are we children stout-hearted, Papa? Of course. All the Sagers have been stout-hearted, or great-grandfather would have never got to Germany, or grandfather to the United States, or my father to Ohio, or we to Missouri. We'll have to be stout-hearted to get to Oregon, but we will. At the head of the steps, the door opened and the governor's wife called. "You girls must be getting cold out there. Come in. You can see Oregon tomorrow." Catherine felt wild, delirious joy sweep through her. "Elizabeth, Matilda, Henrietta, stop that crying. We're in Oregon. We got here." She felt her sisters relax, felt the answering joy that straightened their drooping bodies. Oregon. We're in Oregon. Hand in hand, laughing through their tears, the four of them marched up the steps into their new life. Now, this is actually just what happened afterwards. It tells a little bit more of the story. What happened afterwards? It would be comforting to think that the troubles of the surviving Sager girls were now over with, that kind friends took them in and kept them together as the women's had done. But this did not happen. The Oregon settlers were mostly poor, struggling and plentiful supplied with children of their own. A family might take in one child, but not four. Consequently, the Sager girls were separated and never lived together again as a family. They accepted this situation with the same courage they had always shown. In their separate homes, they went to school whenever there was a chance, worked hard, but had a few good times and married young. None of them ever held any resentment towards the Indians. As they grew up, they came to understand the causes of the massacre. First, the Indians felt the incoming white settlers threatened their homes. Then the tragic deaths of so many Indian children from measles, and the false story spread by Joe Louis so upset and inflamed them that the desperate, grieving men had killed people who were trying to be their friends. Henrietta, youngest of the girls, had no children and died at the age of 26 after being mistakenly shot by a desperado in the mining town where she and her husband were living. The other three sisters all raised large families. Catherine and Matilda had 8 children each, and Elizabeth 9. Their descendants are scattered up and down the Pacific coast and into the Midwest. As time passed, Catherine realized that she and her sisters had to live through an important period of As time passed, Catherine realized that she and her sisters had lived through an important period of American history that should be recorded by someone who had been on the scene. Therefore, almost 10 years after coming to Oregon, she wrote a detailed account of the family's journey across the plains, of their life at the Women Mission, of the massacre, and their final journey to Oregon. Catherine hoped to see it in book form and even dreamed that it might make enough money to set up an orphanage in memory of Narcissa Whitman. She was never able to find a publisher, but her story, carefully preserved by her children and her grandchildren, is one of the most authentic stories of information about the tragic episode and is constantly used by historians and researchers. Eventually, the 3 girls did hear from relatives. One uncle and his family moved to California and once visited Catherine in Oregon. On the 15th anniversary of the Whitman massacre, the 3 sisters were invited to be honored guests at the dedication of a monument on the site of the mission. It stands there today, a tall marble shaft like a finger pointing to the sky on the hill above a beautiful valley the girls had all come to love. In 1940, the grounds and the gravestone and the great grave, now covered with a marble slab containing the names of who died on that terrible site, became the Whitman Mission National Historical Site, visited by thousands of tourists each year. The 3 sisters all lived to a good age. Catherine and her husband, Clark Pringledge, spent their later years in the home of their youngest child, Louisa Collins, in Spokane, Washington, where she passed away August 10, 1910, at the age of 75. Elizabeth died on July 19, 1925, in Portland, Oregon, a few days after her 88th birthday. Matilda, last of the original Sager family, was living with a daughter in California when she died on April 13, 1828, aged 89. The participants in the story were not without their faults. Many things they said and did in the light of today's understanding seem to have been mistaken. But of their courage and dedication to duty as they saw it, there is to be no question. They were truly stout-hearted folk. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's the end of our book. Just a little bit of a heads up, the next read-aloud book that we are going to do is by Kate DiCamillo. Some of you have already read it, but it is called Because of Winn-Dixie. I personally have not read it, but it is extremely well thought of, and a lot of people, including Mr. Holt, say it's fantastic. I have read that author's other works before, but we're going to read that together, and hopefully we'll start it sometime early next week. Hope you guys are all doing well, staying safe, keep up with the learning, stay classy, Golden Eagles.